Hey Facebook universe. We have talked a lot about centennials in our Facebook Lives. We've talked about our centennial, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. We've talked about 100 years since the passing of William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. But today we want to bring you another centennial, the centennial of the U.S. entry into World War I. I hear people to my right. I'm going to... Okay, we're good. The U.S. entry into World War I on April 6, 1917. Now, the war started in 1914. For all you...
We like celebrating 103 anniversaries.
But the war began in 1914, and the United States was considered a neutral party. However, they were providing munitions for a lot of the other countries. But things really started heating up in 1916, and it kind of all came to a head in March of 1916 when the Russians, when the Germans sank a French ship called the Sussex. And at that point, President Woodrow Wilson basically threatened to sever ties of diplomacy with Germany if they didn't stop their unrestricted submarine attacks on merchants and passenger ships. Later that year, the Germans agreed to the Sussex Pledge. But by 1917, things were starting to kick back up with turmoil again, and in January of 1917, German naval officers were able to convince Kaiser Wilhelm that they could basically end the war if they got rid of the Sussex Pledge, if they were able to resume their unrestricted submarine warfare. And then also that same month was the time that the British found the Zimmermann and intercepted and decoded the Zimmermann telegram, which was when Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, sent a note to the German ambassador to Mexico to basically entice them to set up against the United States, saying that they would help them after the war regain territory that they had once lost from the U.S. And Woodrow Wilson at this point, coming into the spring of 1917, a lot of things had been changing. Public perception of the war was changing in the United States. And on April 2nd, he went to a joint session of Congress and he requested for a declaration of war. And by April 6th, the Senate and the House voted in favor, and the United States was involved officially in World War I. So for today, we wanted to talk a little bit about the firearms, obviously, the manufacturers that were involved, because this really is a turning point for U.S. gun manufacturers. And at the beginning of the war in 1914, a lot of manufacturers that you remember and associate with World War I really didn't have a lot of military guns. Remington, for example, had some rolling blocks that the Allies were able to buy and reconvert and use. But by the end of the war, companies like Remington, companies like Winchester were major world military powers. And so we wanted to talk about a lot of the firearms that they were using, a lot of the other firearms. It's a very Allied-centric storyline that we've got going on today, but we wanted to talk about the different firearms that you're able to see at the Cody Firearms Museum in our World War I case, which we are standing in front of right now. And like I said, very U.S., Great Britain, French-oriented case up here, and downstairs we have a lot of the Central Powers firearms as well. But today we're focusing on America. So if I'll have Jesse come in and zoom in, and we'll talk about some of the guns that we have in this case that were significant to World War I. And the first one is, first two are our shotguns. And the one that you see closer to the back is a Winchester Model 1897. And if you follow our videos, you know I love me some 1897 trivia. But this particular one is a trench gun that was used during World War I. Now, shotgun use in warfare was kind of something that was uniquely American. And the 1897s were initially adopted, and it was the first known use of a major, shotgun effort in the war back way earlier with the 1897s, right at the turn of the 1900s. And the initial 1897 that was used for warfare was a riot gun, which had a 20-inch barrel. But by U.S. involvement in World War I, General Pershing and the United States Army wanted to come up with a firearm that would be great for trench warfare. And so they took the concept of the riot gun and they maintained the 20-inch barrel, but they also wanted to find a way to attach a bayonet, which was a little more difficult when you considered the large bore nature of a shotgun. It was very common with rifles, with muskets in the historic past, but it wasn't necessarily common with shotguns. And so Winchester worked with Springfield Armory to come up with an adapter and a bayonet that they could use with the 1897. And if you'll pan up to the bayonet, the other thing that they added was a ventilated handguard, because guess what? When you shoot a shotgun, it gets hot. So one of the things they wanted to make sure was if you ended up having to use it as a bayonet, that the barrel wouldn't burn you, wouldn't be something that you weren't going to be able to use it. And so we have the Winchester Model 1897. It was probably one of the most popular shotguns used during World War I. And I keep looking at Danny over here, and nobody can see me. I'm including him in the narrative.
Thank you.
Right next to the 1897 is a gun that people don't often talk about, which is the Model 12 slide action trench shotgun. And if you, as you're panning upwards, you'll see that they use the same adapter for the bayonet with the Model 12. Now there weren't that many used during World War I. They really kind of came into their element during World War II. But it's kind of a unique little storyline to see these shotguns being used. So shotguns, something that for centuries have been considered a sporting culture type thing, starting to be a very big player in modern warfare.
Yeah.
And so I'm now going to let Danny talk about one of the more popular rifles of the war, the BAR.
So when the U.S. entered World War I, their standard issue automatic weapons were, excuse me, the 1909 Benet Merci, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, and the 1904 Maxim gun. And we don't associate those guns with World War I. The iconic American guns that came out of this war were guns like this, the BAR, the Browning Automatic Rifle. And we don't associate those guns with that usage because we, as far as most people believe, neither the 1909 or the 1904 were used in combat during World War I. And Ashley is holding a really cool piece from the Winchester factory collection, which is a cutaway BAR used as a training aid to show how all the internal mechanisms are working when the gun operates. You'll see the Winchester number stamped on the buttstock and all the different pieces that are cut away where you can see the internals of the gun and the gas system and magazine and all that cool stuff. So when the U.S. decided to join the war, they were looking at what automatic weapons they could add to their arsenal, and John Browning was working on this design that became the BAR, and it was submitted to the Ordnance Board and in May 1917, and the U.S. said, yes, we want a lot of these and we want them as soon as possible. And so they took the design from Colt, who had been working on it, back to Winchester, who, if you know your Winchester history, Browning had his breakup with Winchester, and I'm gonna, what was the date?
Quoting Ashley, the breakup, the letter was 1903. 1903.
So after a little over a decade, they had to go back to work together, and Winchester would be the largest producer of the Browning automatic rifle during World War I, and would end up building 47,000, and just over 100,000 were built for the U.S. Army. They didn't make it overseas to France until the summer of 1918, so very late in the war. A few of them made it into combat by September, but then the war was over in November. So they didn't see a ton of combat use, but the troops that did get to use them liked them a lot. And we'll talk about another gun that they had to use before the BAR in a little bit that they did not like as much. But that's
spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
You can probably see it back on the table. So yeah, that's the short version of the BAR. And now Ashley is holding. Do you want me to hold it while you talk about it?
Sure.
Right.
Danny's now Vanna White. The next gun that we're going to talk about is another John Browning design. I think we should have kept a John Browning tally of all of the Browning designs that are used in the First World War. And that's, of course, the Colt Model 1911. What?
Only that one. I'm doing this one.
Well, that one's cool. So we're going to talk about it for a second. Chill out, Danny. We're not there yet. Danny's dejected now. The Colt Model 1911. Now, the Colt Model 1911 semi-automatic and 45 was a popular gun at the onset of the war. It was actually the standard issue handgun of pretty much all the branches. And so it's no shock that the Colt Model 1911 makes an appearance in the war. When the war starts, though, the Colt is not able to produce, as most companies are not during wartime, are not able to produce to the level that they need for the wartime effort. And so one thing that you'll see a lot throughout all real global history is that you'll see a lot of manufacturers coming on to try to work on these models. Remington had their 1911. The initial contract, though, was a little bit of a failure because the parts had to be completely interchangeable amongst all of the companies, and so the design drawings that had to go into it and the process that had to go into making sure that their parts would be interchangeable with the other 1911s caused that to be a failure. But the 1911 was a really popular handgun used in World War I and still is today. But Danny, now it's your moment, Danny. It's your moment. But this one is a really rare one, and it's probably one of the only one known in existence. And that is because we all talk about Colt, we talk about Remington with the 1911 during World War I, but one thing we don't talk about is Winchester. And Winchester did, in 1917, receive the contract to make 1911s. And this cutaway that Danny is holding right now is a Colt cutaway that they sent to the Winchester factory so that they could then design their 1911 for the war effort. However, the war ended shortly after that, so we don't really know if there were a lot made. I believe the Winchester designation was G18P. Is that correct, Danny?
19, but whatever.
Close enough. G19P. And we know that we have the cutaway of it. There is some evidence to show that there were about 200 made, but I haven't seen one. So if you see one that comes across the market, we'd love to know, because this is really the only one that we have in the collection, only one that we know about. But Winchester worked with Colt on the 1911 during World War I. The next gun that we're going to showcase is right next to that, and it's a revolver. And this is Smith & Wesson, model 1917. And this gun, which was originally called, is a modified version of the New Century revolver. And the New Century revolver had already been issued to Great Britain. About 70,000 of them had already been issued to Great Britain in 455 Webley before the United States' involvement in the war. But once the United States got involved, the U.S. Ordnance Office in 1917 contracted them for a modified version of it, which was chambered in 45 ACP. They began production on October 27th of 1917, and by the time they canceled the contract in 1919, they had made about 150,000 of them. And one of the things they did with this is that it's a rimless 45 ACP cartridge, which is a little bit different. And they worked with that because of these half-moon clips that you can see on the other side of the gun. But I thought it was kind of interesting. I'm not a World War I expert arms specialist, and so I thought it was really interesting when I, was walking through and looking at the cases, because I don't often think about revolvers. I mean, I think about British revolvers, but I don't normally think about U.S. revolvers when we're talking about all the major wars. We always kind of go to the semi-autos instantly in our brain. So that's a Smith & Wesson model 1917.
All right, so behind the Smith & Wesson 1917, and we had this discussion yesterday while we were prepping, there's a lot of model 1917s in World War I. So as you're watching, you'll hear us say that a lot. But this is the model 1903 rifle you see behind us. And quick shout out to Tim. Hi, Tim. Just noticed your comment. Thanks for watching. You get singled out because you're the only one to comment so far.
Woo!
But these are our 1903 rifles, a couple iterations of them. You'll notice two versions with scopes mounted to them that the U.S. used as sniper rifles during the war. You'll notice kind of a more standard variation with the stripper clip loaded, and those are not live rounds, just FYI. And with the bayonet on, and then one loaded with dummy rounds for training purposes. So the model 1903 was the U.S. standard issue arm going into World War I, and Ashley is holding one of ours here. And don't mind the World War II era sling, no big deal.
Gun nerds, unite.
So I'm sure somebody will tell us why it's terrible later, but
it's an educational gun.
Right, this is our educational gun. We use it for lots of demonstrations in the galleries and that kind of thing. So
yeah.
We have it set up for a little bit later use. 1903 bolt action was the standard issue U.S. rifle going into the war. They had about 600,000 on hand, but the Army anticipated a need for a lot more rifles than that, and would end up adding another widely issued rifle that we'll talk about here in a minute. Again, spoiler alerts. This rifle's in .30-06, has a 5-round magazine, heavily influenced by the German Mauser design. The U.S. encountered the Mausers in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, and decided they wanted to adopt something very much similar to that rifle, and they did in the 1903 Springfield.
Is this our advertisement?
What advertisement?
For the Pedersen device.
Oh, right. Hey, so you may notice a really cool piece that's not in this case called the Pedersen device. And that was a device that replaced the bolt on a standard 1903 with a new bolt, a blowback operated gun that was converted a bolt action rifle to a semi-auto, and it fired a pistol caliber cartridge with a 40-round detachable magazine. So a really cool piece designed for trench war. They made, I want to say between 60,000, something like that, 60, 70,000. Most of them were scrapped after the war, so very few exist today, and not even we have one. So if you have one and want to donate it,
we would love to have it. And go right here.
So that's the Pedersen device. I don't know that it saw a ton of combat, but it was one of those things. They were trying to come up with more firepower for the trenches, use things like shotguns, come up with conversions to the semi-auto rifles, or to the bolt action rifles, excuse me, that they had to try and increase their firepower in the trenches. Mm-hmm. So moving on to our Lewis gun. We can't hold this one, it's in the case. This is the Lewis gun. This was an American design that Colonel Lewis had been working on before the war, but was never adopted by the American Army. It was used by the Marine Corps prior to the war. They were issued some, but it didn't see U.S. service during World War I, or at least U.S. action in France. The big buyers of this during the war were the UK and Belgium, and in British service, this gun was widely used. It became kind of the most common sort of light machine gun they had, although it still weighs like 28 pounds, which is not super light. It's a very distinctive looking gun. It has this big barrel jacket on it. It has a pan magazine, unusual features, and the reason for them are that if you'll notice under the magazine there's some fins right there. This is an air-cooled machine gun, and those fins go down the length of the barrel and act as a heat sink, and as the gun fires, when it fires, the gas escaping out the end kind of acts as a negative pressure source and draws air over those fins to cool the barrel. So air-cooled machine gun, a very distinctive looking gun. The British used them a lot, really liked them. They were a reliable, good weapon for them. And the Marines had been issued some prior to the war, but the Army had never adopted them. And when the Marines got to France, they had their Lewis guns replaced to the guns that the Army was using, much to their disappointment. So they had liked using the Lewis gun in training and in back stateside when they were preparing to come over, but when it was replaced, it was a big disappointment. So that's the Lewis gun.
So right in front of the Lewis gun, you may have seen when Jesse was panning, is the Savage Model 1907 pistol. Now the Savage Model 1907 is most often associated with its failed contract against the Colt semi-automatic way prior to the war and prior to the development of the 1911. However, the Savage was used. It had a English, I speak it. It was a 32. This one is a 32 ACP caliber. It had 10-round double-stack mag. But this one was one of the 40,000 that was contracted for the French military. So U.S. gun contracted for another country, and they were developed. All of those were made between 1914 and 1917. I quite personally like the Savage Model 1907. And fun fact, Buffalo Bill owned a Savage Model 1907 that's gone to auction a couple of times, but not one of the more often talked about guns because Colt tends to steal the spotlight.
Does steal the spotlight.
But if we're doing 1907, Jesse, why don't you switch up to the Model 1907 that has the lovely bag attached to it? And I just like to point this one out because we have several of them. Model 1907 was designed by T.C. Johnson. It's a semi-automatic. And this one and one that's back in our Winchester gallery are particularly interesting because they have that bag on that. And that was essentially to catch spent cartridge cases because, well, they didn't want it to pile up in an aircraft. So they just moved a table, but a very weird squeaky noise. They didn't want the cartridge cases to build up in the aircraft, and so they added these bags to it. Real simple explanation, but looks kind of nutty when you're walking through the gallery. It's definitely something that draws your eye. And then if you will, Jesse, pan to the left side of the case, I'll mention to cue Danny up and the rest of the rifles we're going to be talking about. And that is, we have a couple of iterations of the Canadian Ross, which is a straight pull bolt action in 303. The Canadian Ross is developed obviously in Canada, and the one on the left was one of the ones that was ordered for training for the U.S. government, but it wasn't super popular. They actually lovingly called it the Canadian Club because it wasn't really a great mechanism and firearm used for trench warfare. It was prone to jamming and had a lot of different issues, especially when using just standard cartridges. But the other thing with it is some of the models, the bolt actually could be put in backwards, which ended badly. What did you say this morning, Danny? I thought it was kind of funny.
Compromised.
Well, that's what I said. It could be compromised. But the bolt could actually be put in backwards. Obviously, I don't think I need to explain that would be a little bad for anyone who would be shooting it after that. But the Canadian Ross wasn't overly popular during World War I because of the issues it had, and so the Lee Enfield was used a lot more than that during the war by the different countries.
So if Jesse goes behind the Ross, you'll see kind of a smattering of various rifles. We have a Russian Mosin Nagant, we have a Winchester 1895 musket, a British pattern 14 bolt action, and the US model 1917 here horizontally. So we'll just work our way across here. The Russian 1891 Mosin Nagant was their standard issue service rifle they adopted in 1891, and it would be their standard rifle for World War I, but like all the major powers at the outbreak of the war, they experienced severe arms shortages, and so they came to the US with the design and contracted with Remington and a company called New England Westinghouse to build rifles for them. And this would be one of the largest foreign contracts in the US during World War I. The total contracts were around 3 million guns. Of those, I've seen a lot of different figures on how many were produced, but between 1.5 and 2.5 million were built of those contracts. When Russia had its revolution in 1917, that put an end to a stop to the work on that contract, and kind of left these two gun makers kind of in the lurch. They had a lot of stockpile. They had invested a lot of money in building these guns, and machinery and factory improvements and resources. And so the U.S. government stepped in to kind of bail these guys out and bought up just under 300,000 of the rifles to kind of give them an early form of a government bailout and save them. So some of these actually did see U.S. service. They were issued stateside as training rifles. Some made it overseas to Russia. About 500,000 made it to Russia and saw use in American-made Russian rifles, saw use with the Russian army. And then after the war, the U.S. sent some troops to Russia to intervene in the Russian Civil War, and those troops, instead of being issued 1903s, were given these arms to use there. So kind of an oddball in U.S. service, but it did see some issue to the U.S. military. The one to the right of those two, the Winchester 1895 musket, they didn't use musket like we do today. They used musket, at least Winchester did, to refer to kind of any full-length stocked military configuration rifle. So this was an adaptation of Winchester's famous 1895 lever action, chambered for 7.62 by 54R, which was the Russian service cartridge at the time, and adapted to take a bayonet. For commercial sales, it was completely a sporting rifle. Most of the commercial ones in the U.S. you'll see just don't have a top handguard. They have a shorter sporting handguard or stock and a shorter barrel. So again, Winchester, it took time for these companies to tool up to make foreign designs. So what Winchester did is tried to sell some of its existing designs that they were already equipped to manufacture, and that's what Russia bought with this gun. They ordered 300,000, and this whole contract was delivered before the Russian Revolution and issued to Russian troops. And you can find, there's not a lot of archival material about how they were issued or where they went, but you do find a lot of photos of Russian troops using this on the Eastern Front during World War I. And then the other foreign design that U.S. manufacturers made a lot of during the war was the British Pattern 14. Prior to the war, the British were looking to replace their short magazine Lee Enfields, the SMLEs, and they had come up with a design known as the Pattern 13 to replace that, influenced heavily by a Mauser action, kind of like the U.S. 1903 Springfield. And they were experimenting with that when war broke out, and so that kind of put an end to the experiments. And again, Great Britain realized they needed a lot more rifles and a lot more production than they had available. So instead of retooling all their factories for this new gun, they kept producing the previous iterations of the Enfield and brought this design to U.S. manufacturers, most notably Winchester and Remington, and a Remington subsidiary named Eddystone. And so those companies were contracted to produce this gun, and the experimental design had been in a different caliber, but they reverted the design back to 303, the standard British service cartridge. And this one actually caused a lot of problems with American manufacturers. They complained of really severe British inspections and the British rejecting rifles, and at one point work almost stopped at the Winchester factory because of the breakdown in communications between British inspectors and Winchester employees.
What did you post on Reddit, Danny?
Oh, Winchester had 99 problems, mostly British inspectors. But when the U.S. joined the war, they also, again, common theme, needed more production and more rifles. And so instead of switching Winchester and Remington back to produce 1903 rifles, they said, we'll just adapt the Pattern 14 to American ammunition, the 30-06. And that's what they came up with in the spring of 1917. And by May, Winchester was building model 1917 parts. So it's basically the same configuration as the Pattern 14, but chambered in 30-06. For American usage. And Winchester and Remington, since they had already been tooled up and had a lot of experience building the Pattern 14, were able to build a lot of these and built over 1 million guns for the U.S. And this became actually a little bit more common in France to see a U.S. troop armed with a 1917 rather than a 1903. And Gary Cooper is famous for playing Alvin York and carrying a 1903, but it's actually, most people believe now that he was carrying probably a model 1917 rifle, sometimes referred to as the American Enfield, although it's not really an Enfield action, but whatever.
Hey Ron, thanks for thinking we have a great display. We like to call him Danny.
Awesome. So we have a couple more guns here to talk about before we wrap up today. This is a French rifle, the model 0715 Berthier. This was not the standard issue French service rifle during World War I. That was the 1886 Lebel, but they did supplement that issue with this rifle. This one has been, the stock's been cut down, but normally in service it had a full-length stock, and Remington received a contract to build these prior to the American entry to the war, and what was a bit of a common theme during the war, Remington and French inspectors did not get along either, much like Winchester.
I see a theme emerging.
There is. There were also problems with Russian inspectors, so, you know, lots of cultural breakdowns.
Not that we're hating on inspectors and what they do. Hashtag thanks, guys. Hashtag
Remington did receive a contract for a few 100,000 of these guns. Ultimately, that contract went so poorly, and the French updated this design to the Model 16 with a larger magazine, and so they canceled their contract with Remington after only a small portion had been delivered. And what was left over, a few of these show up in the U.S. after the war, but the French still use the rifle, just never any of the American-built ones. So, and when American troops went to France, some of them were integrated into French units, most notably a few of the African-American regiments, and those were equipped wholly with French-issue gear, and many of those troops received Berthier rifles instead of American-built guns. So.
Yes, Robert, you did see a show on the table.
He did indeed.
We couldn't talk about guns in World War I and not talk about this lovely French machine gun. Here's its magazine.
So this is the French Chichot, and as the many American troops referred to it, that is, its actual designation was the, oh man, I'm going to get the order of the letters wrong, but CSRG, CRSG?
Brought to you by the letters.
Model 1915. This was a pre-war French design that some French designers, lots of words. I can't speak.
Danny's done.
I'm done. Pre-war French design. They had been working on it prior to the outbreak of World War I, but it wasn't ready to see service until 1915 when it was adopted. And while it has a pretty poor reputation, it did see widespread use in the French military, and when the U.S. joined the war, they needed automatic rifles as well, and before BAR production could ramp up, they bought a number of these guns from the French. And as mentioned, the Marine Corps had been using the Lewis guns stateside, had bought some, and were training with those. When they got to France, they were reissued. The Lewis guns were taken away, and they were issued some of these, and they really hated that. The gun had reliability issues with the magazine.
You said that so politely. Some reliability issues.
Some issues.
Yeah.
It was compromised.
Compromised.
The walls of the magazine could get dented. This open side could let mud and dirt in. The spring had to make this real long travel around it because of the curved 8mm Lebel cartridge. So lots of issues. But the French kept it in service throughout the whole war. The Americans bought some and used them. American troops hated them. The Americans actually tried to adapt the design to 30-06 and ordered some from the French producers in 30-06, known as the Model 1918, and that went even worse. The gun did not adapt well to American ammunition, higher pressure, different shape to the cartridge, and that went so poorly that very few of those, if any, actually saw frontline combat service, because for the American troops, they're very thankful that the BAR had started to show up by then. So that is the show. And we have uno mas, one more gun to talk about this
Uno
morning.
mas. And then I'm going to go rogue because Jesse had to leave, and I'm now manning the camera. So I'm going to go rogue right after the Burton, but it'll be real quick. But it's some cool stuff, I promise. Maybe.
So we talked about Winchester self-loaders a little bit ago, the 1907, and this is another Winchester self-loader. This is the Burton machine rifle, designed in 1917. It was submitted to the Ordnance Board, but not put in production. It's a very distinctive looking gun, as you can tell. It has these crazy dual magazine
Twin
arrangement.
top magazine.
Twin magazine arrangement on top. Two 20-round magazines. It's got this distinctive handguard and ribbed barrel. It's just a really unusual gun, really cool gun. It is select fire, semi-automatic or full auto. It was designed to be used in aircraft, so you can see a ring mount if Ashley gets in close here, right there.
You're too tall, lower it down. There we go, hey.
And this screw right there, that comes out and allows you to not really quick change the barrel, but easily change the barrel. It also, despite being designed to be used in aircraft, does have a bayonet lug on the end of the barrel in case you wanted to use it for ground rolls too. It is chambered in 345 self-loading, which is an adaptation of 351 self-loading, which is the cartridge the 1907 was chambered in, and is really similar to a lot of, qualifies as kind of an intermediate cartridge. So we like to call this the first assault rifle. So
We like to call it that.
we like to, not everybody else does, but we like to.
Whatever.
It's a design that's really ahead of its time, as it incorporates a lot of features that you would see in later select fire intermediate cartridge guns. So a really cool piece of Winchester history that we're fortunate to have here, designed by Frank Burton, who worked on a lot of Winchester's designs from that period. It was a very capable designer. So
Cool.
the Burton machine rifle.
Woohoo! All right, I'm going to hand the camera off to Dan, who's also currently manning the lights. We're very short-staffed this morning. Thanks, Jesse. All right, and if Dan will hold it, I wanted to kind of come over to one section, and if Gary will stay with our firearms, you know, because we don't just leave firearms out for the visitors to play with. We're going to walk down this way because we talked about all of these different manufacturers. We talked about having to rev up production, which is a really important thing during the war, especially when if we ever talk about World War II guns, spoiler alert, I think that we can show you a lot of the different manufacturers, industries that get involved in making firearms throughout world wars. But the one thing that we always like to talk about with Winchester is that Winchester becomes this major, global manufacturer for military purposes, but Oliver Winchester always wanted it to be. And after the war, what happens when your contracts go away?
Everybody planned for the war to go into 1918, or at least a lot of people planned for the war to last that long, or 1919, excuse me.
I was like, wait, what? I just learned something new this morning.
Hashtag new facts.
Yeah. Hashtag alternative facts.
There it is. So when these contracts were issued to these firearms companies like Winchester, like Remington, they were for much higher than actual production because they expected them to last for a whole nother year at least. And so when the war ended in 1918, the government was like, well, we're not buying any more guns for a lot of these contracts, and cut them off. And Winchester spent a couple of years in kind of negotiations to try and get some payout for the costs that they had incurred in building up to get ready to produce these contracts, and then having the contract none of the payments delivered. And it was a big financial hit for a lot of these companies.
And so what a lot of companies did, and it's true for modern companies as well, they went into other industries. We have a really squeaky floor, so Dan, if you can come in here, we'll... How did you make it squeak?
I don't know. It's like right here.
There it is. Good authentic floor. If you'll kind of walk in and pan around, we're quickly training you. You can add this to your resume and your job description. This is our Winchester store. And what happened after World War I ended and Winchester was trying to find a way to kind of stay afloat in their market was that they started making all kinds of tools. That is a long habit. I can't read that with my glasses on. All kinds of tools, accessories, figure skates, rollerblades. We even have a Winchester perfume and champagne, cologne. One of those words that has hidden letters. Winchester cologne. And so what Winchester would do is, it's been a long video so far, what Winchester would do is that they would basically buy up the best of all the companies, and they would learn about how to do stuff from the staff, and then they would take over and make all of these different kinds of products. But this is the store that we call things where Winchester didn't go bang. And you can see just really how diverse they got. Unfortunately for Winchester, it didn't really pull them out of their slump because in the 1930s they had to go into receivership and get bought out by their competitor. But it was a way that Winchester, in addition to a lot of other firearms companies, and it's been going on for 100 years now, find a way to continue to find new markets and keep selling and keep their numbers up even in times of peace. All right, we're gonna come over here.
That's close.
He's Danny's too tall for. So we hope you guys liked our video on World War I, some of the firearms of World War I. We certainly learned a lot trying to study up for this, as it's neither of our specialties. But it's a really important day, an interesting centennial, another centennial for 1917. And we're happy that we were able to bring you in, take a look at some of our guns that don't get talked about a lot. So I hope you all have a really good day. If you have a comment, you know where to ask it. Bye.